It's wonderful. Oh my goodness, it is so wonderful to see you in here in person and not through a screen, although I know that some are watching and will watch this at a later time. But good morning and welcome physically to Washington Hebrew Congregation's Amram Scholar Series. I'm Rabbi Susan Shankman, and I look forward to this morning's presentation, which we bring to you in partnership with the Jewish Book Council. And we are so thrilled to present our first in-person Amram Scholar Series in more than 18 months. This is a Shehechianu moment. I know several of you said this is the first time I'm going to be here in person. Just raise your hand if this is your first time back in person. So, or in a long time, or ever, maybe. So we will welcome you back, and certainly this morning, I know that we will have the opportunity to learn and to engage. And our speaker this morning will present first, and then we'll engage in a Q&A session, as is often our format with Amram. But just to remind everyone, we have Lainey Weiss with us, and thank you, Lainey, for being here. She will have a basket with index cards and pencils, and if you have questions that you want to ask of our speaker, she will help you. Just give a little raise of the hand, and she'll bring you a card to write down. Or if you want one before we start, I'm sure she could do that as well, so that then you can just write down those questions or notes as we move along this morning. I also encourage you to purchase a copy of Ms. Strauss's book following the conclusion of this morning's program. We'll have a book signing if you already have one or if you are going to purchase, and I highly, highly recommend that you do. And this is also, as I mentioned, through the Jewish Book Council, and we hope that will be fully supportive, not just with our presence, but also if you haven't yet had a chance. I know that you will be intrigued this morning and want to read the book. So we'll be having a book signing directly following our program. Our speaker this morning is Gwen Strauss, who is the author of The Nine by St. Martin's Press, which follows the true story of her great-aunt, or great-aunt. It depends. One side of my family, it's great-aunt. One side, it's great-aunt. Her great-aunt, who led a band of 9 female resistance fighters as they escaped a German forced labor camp and made a 10-day journey across the front lines of World War II from Germany back to Paris. Her other books include The Hiding Game, a middle-grade reader about artists hiding from the Gestapo in Marseille with the help of Varian Fry in 1940, Trail of Stones, a book of poetry, The Night Shimmy, a children's picture book, and Ruth and the Green Book, which received wide recognition, including the ALA 2011 Most Notable Middle Grade Reader and Honor Book for the Jane Addams Peace Prize. Her poetry, essays, and short stories have been published in numerous literary magazines and outlets, including Catapult, The New Republic, New England Review, Kenyon Review, Lunday Sunday Times, and Antioch Review. Since 2005, she has lived in southern France with her 3 children. Her daughter, Eliza, is here with us today, and dog Zola, where she's the director of an international artist residency program and cultural center at the Dora Maar House. The house was purchased by Picasso as a breakup gift for his mistress, Dora Maar. Maar lived there until her death in 1997. Strauss's job allows her the privilege of meeting and interacting with artists, writers, and scholars from around the world. And this morning she is going to share with us a story that she is personally connected to through family, but also a unique perspective on a time in history about which many of us have read and explored and spent time engaged in understanding. And this is one additional story and a unique perspective, and a story of courage and resilience, bravery, and really incredibly inspiring. So I'd like to thank Gwen Strauss certainly for writing this book, but even more for being with us today. And we look forward to her presentation. And I present Gwen Strauss.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming today, coming out and being here in person. And also for those who are watching it later, I guess it'll be recorded. I really first just want to thank Rabbi Shankman and Lainey for their help, and also I feel deeply honored to be invited here and to be part of this series, which when I looked online was very impressive, so I feel humbled to be here. And also, it really coincided with the time when I'm in the States, so tonight I fly back to Paris, so this is great. It's sort of the last, event of my time here. So I just can't figure out. Can everyone hear me? Am I okay? Okay. So what I usually do when I talk about my book, The Nine, is instead of really explaining the book, I just talk about sort of the making of, the process that I went through to research this story and how it kind of evolved for me. So what I'm going to show you is a little presentation about sort of my slow discovery of this story. And of course, it began with my great aunt, Helene Podliasky. And it began one day in 2002. I was at lunch with my grandmother, Zabet, and Helene was there, Tante Helene was there, and sort of out of the blue, she started to talk about her time in the resistance and her getting arrested by the Gestapo, her period in a French prison being interrogated and tortured, and her deportation. I didn't know any of this. She never talked about it. It was sort of a family secret. We knew that she was in the resistance. She'd had the Légion d'honneur and several French awards, but she never spoke of her time in Germany, nor did she ever speak of this fact that she escaped with 8 other women. And that was astonishing. She was 83 at the time when she was talking about it, and this was something that happened when she was 23, so it's 60 years later. And I was so impressed by this, I asked if I could record it, come back and interview her and record it. She said yes, and I did that with my other aunt and Aunt Eva. And then we made a transcript, and that was kind of it. For me, that was sort of just a recording of an oral history, and it was an incredible story, but there were a lot of gaps in her story. I left it at that. Now, Tante Helene was an amazing person. She spoke 5 languages fluently, including Russian and Polish and German, French and English. And she was an engineer with many degrees. She was a mathematician. So I knew her as being this incredibly elegant, incredibly smart, successful businesswoman. And this new story about her. So the next sort of piece of the puzzle, because I had just thought, okay, I've just recorded this oral history, was 2 years later there was a book published by a woman named Suzanne Maudet, called in English, 9 Young Women Who Didn't Want to Die. And I started to read this book and realized it's the same story, but not quite, because there were things that were different, and also Helene's name does not appear in it. But someone named Christine is in the book. And I asked Helene, is that you? Were you Christine? And then she explained, yes, that was my nom de guerre, and that's what everybody knew her as. And so this story filled out some of the gaps, and it was written by Zaza, who was Helene's friend from Lycée. They met in Ravensbrück. It tells a little bit of the story of just the escape. And in fact, this book is really, it starts on the day of the escape and ends on the day of the end of the escape. And she doesn't talk about the camps. She doesn't talk about the resistance. She doesn't talk about really what any of the other women did, only their nicknames. So, but at least from Zaza's book, I got an idea that there were 9 women, because my tante Helene didn't remember. And there were 6 were French, 2 were Dutch, and 1 was Spanish. So from Zaza's book, I had a little bit more of the story. And then the next sort of piece of the puzzle came around 2010, when these 2 Dutch filmmakers contacted Helene because they wanted to do a documentary about the escape, because they had read a book written by this woman, Madeleine Verstegen, Lon, who was one of the 9. She was one of the 2 Dutch women. And she had written a book called My War Chronique, which eventually I was able to read. It's in Dutch, but I was able to find her own translation of her text. And it's her version of the events, which are, again, a little bit different. The Dutch filmmakers, by the time they ended up filming, all of the women were dead except for Helene and Lon. And so it's a really beautiful documentary in that it ends with this scene of their reuniting 65 years later. And shortly after both of them would pass away, they were both in their 90s at that time. It's really gorgeous, and it's on. If you're interested in seeing it on my website, there's a link to it. So there was now 3 versions, and also because of these filmmakers, they had found this other person in the group Nicole Clarence. Nicole is one of the 2 Jewish women in the group. They were all arrested all the 9 were arrested as resistance and political prisoners. They had the red triangle. But 2 of them, my tante Helene and Nicole, were Jewish and kept that hidden. And that's probably a lot of why they were able to survive. But Nicole had written an article for Elle magazine that was published in 1965, 20 years after the liberation, where she talks about her time. Interestingly, and I go into this a little bit more in the book, when she published her article, she was admonished by other women survivors for having talked about it. She got letters to the editor. But Nicole is kind of an extraordinary person. She was only 21 when she was arrested by the Gestapo. She was arrested the day after her 21st birthday. And she had been in charge of all the agents de liaison for the whole Paris region and Normandy by age 21. And when she was arrested, it was in August of 1944, which I'm sure many of you know, is when the Allies are about to liberate Paris. So she could hear the liberation happening. She could hear the Allies bombing. Everybody thought that the war, at least as far as Paris was concerned, was soon going to be over, or at least the occupation. But she, unfortunately, was one of the 57,000, which is a term for the last deportation out of Paris. It's not that there were only a couple thousand, but 57 would begin the beginning of their numbers when they arrive in Ravensbrück. So in fact, at that time, the SNCF, the French rail workers, had gone on strike, but the Germans were so determined to get all of the prisoners that they could as slave labor into Germany. They did all sorts of means to make sure that this train continued into Germany. And she recounts in her oral history that she gave as part of the oral history project with the UC California, that as they were going, when they finally looked out and saw the signs in German, they all started to cry because they were convinced that they wouldn't be deported. Sadly, she would spend almost another year in concentration camps. So, and she did give this beautiful oral history that was really helpful for me, but I found that out much, much later through a friend at the American University of Paris. So at this point in the story, it's now around 2016, 2017. I knew 4 points of view. I had, Lon, Helene, Zaza, and Nicole's points of view, and I thought that's so interesting. As a writer, it's always really interesting to have multiple points of view. I thought, well, I'll just write an essay about this story. And I wanted to go to, I'd never really spent time in Germany, even though I happened to be a German citizen because my grandfather was a German Jew who escaped the Nazis, and because of that I reclaimed our citizenship so that we could stay in Europe. So I thought it would be really interesting, and my older daughter, Sophie, was home, and I thought, we could do this trip together. We'll try to retrace the route, and I'll write an essay for a magazine article or something like that, and that will be it. I didn't know the name of the other, so I knew those 4, but I didn't know the other 5. I only knew their nicknames. And I thought, well, I had sort of this mistaken idea that they had gone to Buchenwald because they were sort of confused about that in some of the accounts. And so we went to Buchenwald. Neither Sophie nor I had ever been to a concentration camp. As I said, we had hardly spent any time in Germany. And I think it was that day in Buchenwald that changed my mind. I was so stunned by the experience, as was my daughter, that I really decided at that point that I couldn't write an article or an essay, that I didn't know what I was talking about, and that I really had to do much more learning before I could dare to write something in a way. That was kind of the beginning for me to realize, oh, this is a huge story, and how dare I? I have to honor them completely. So one of the other places that Sophie and I went in this trip was Leipzig, Hassag, because that's where the women were Leipzig, because that's where the women had escaped from. I mean, I would find this out later, but they were sent to Ravensbrück, and then from there selected for enslaved labor, and sent to one of the commandos, which was in Hassag, Leipzig, and it was this armament factory where they made Panzerfaust, which are the rocket-held grenade launchers that you see here. My tante Helene talked about this quite a bit because she was very proud of the fact that she was able to sabotage the making of these shells. She was able to do this because she was an engineer, and because of her language skills. She had befriended one of the foremen in the foreman in the factory, Fritz Stupitz, who they became quite close, and he put her in charge of the temperature gauges of the forges. He did that knowingly, knowing that she would sabotage. She was able to set the temperature gauges so that they read the false temperature, so the tempering of the shells were faulty and they would explode upon use. So this happened. They were so successful in this sabotage that they were constantly being inspected, because the Germans thought there must be something wrong with the machines, not ever suspecting that starving women were capable of something like this. So when my Tante Hélène told me her story, she really wanted me to understand that this was for her kind of a crucial, she'd stayed a soldier the whole time. So in Leipzig, the women, that's really where the women met each other and formed a group of 9. This is also where they spent 9 months. Leipzig, the Hasag factories had an average life expectancy for men of 3 months and for women of 6 months. And all of these women were there for 9 months. You know, obviously 12 hours a day. They had quotas of 7 tons per person per day. They were many injuries. Zaza crushed her hand. But it was also where they formed really strong friendships and quite beautiful, moving acts of solidarity amongst the women. I argue in my book that one of the reasons I think the women were able to survive longer was because they did act in solidarity with each other. They understood that survival depended on their working as a group. And the factory was bombed in April. It was bombed quite consistently by the Allies because they knew it was armaments. Leipzig, as you probably know, was pretty much flattened. And finally, in April, it was shut down, and they were then thrown out onto this death march. The death marches were this period at the end of the war, the last 4 months of the war, really beginning in January of 1945 with Auschwitz, where the Germans were trying to empty out their slave labor ahead of advancing Allies. It was an incredibly deadly time. In fact, for survivors, it would be the most deadly time. Over, I think, 35% of them would die with mass executions. They would die. They were sent out onto the roads with no water, no food, no plan, really. When I looked at this, I couldn't figure out why they were doing this. All these camps were being emptied, and people were being sort of shuttled around. And I think it had to do with Himmler, who was in charge of the concentration camp system, and he was trying to negotiate a separate peace with the Americans, thinking he could use these people as collateral in a bargain. But the end result was that it was a deadly time, and the women knew this. The women in the group of 9 there had been a group of women from Auschwitz who had arrived at Leipzig in sort of a chaotic moment, and some of them, they had been able to save several of them and hide them in their block. They knew that if they were practically dead when they arrived, and if they were separated out, they would be selected for extermination. So they kept these women hidden in their block, shared their food with them, and learned the story of the death march from these women, these Jewish women from Auschwitz. So when they are set on a death march, the women recognize. They say to themselves, we have one choice. It's we either escape or we die. So they make this choice to escape. So when I went to Leipzig, I spoke. There's a little teeny memorial museum at the Leipzig Hasag site of the old camp, which is now a scientific environmental center. And when I went there with Sophie, my daughter, we had to kind of. It's really hard to find, and it's like barriers, and I had to drive in past it with a car. That thing where you drive really close to another car, so you slip past the barrier. And Sophie, made a little sound like, "Oh no!" And I was, no. They held her here as a prisoner for almost a year. We can come in here. But when I finally found the little memorial museum, which is really a trailer, there was a lovely archivist, and I spoke with her, and she later would email me this list, which was sort of the beginning for me of the research. because there was Helene's name. And someone had written next to her name, so there's Helene Podliasky, which is how the Nazis knew her, and then someone has written Helene next to her name. And then there's Zaza's name right above her, and there's Lon there. And I was like, oh, could this be the José they were talking about? And then there's Gigi. Well, first of all, I noticed the list is not in alphabetical order. It's kind of in who's standing next to who. And so I thought, well, if it's a group, maybe I can find them by looking around who's up, because the list was quite long. So this was the beginning of also, I have to say, when you see an actual Nazi document with your Tante Hélène on it, it's really powerful. It sort of makes it tangible in a way. So I started to do this research, and I started to, I discovered that they had been sent to Ravensbrück. And that was a big shift in my understanding of what had happened to them. And the story of Ravensbrück was a really important part of their story. And then my research became much deeper. And on a third trip to Germany, I was able to go to Ravensbrück with my sister. And you know, it was the history of this camp is so troubled. So this was a place where I really figured out that the women hadn't spoken about their story. The women were very ashamed of being in Ravensbrück, that the group of 9 women hadn't talked about their story because there was a sort of a taboo around it. And in fact, when I would start to do the research, I would find out that they rarely spoke with their families about it. And it was interesting that my Tante Hélène spoke to me, who was a distant niece, and not directly with her own family. So after 2 years of research, I knew that where the women had been and where, you know, the route. I knew that they had started in Ravensbrück, they had been selected and sent to Leipzig. They went on the death march up into Auschwitz, where they escaped. And then they spent 9 days going through the German landscape, walking, trying to find their way to the US soldiers. They had the Russians on one side and the American allies Americans on another side, and they were desperate to find the Americans. They had heard terrible stories about the Russian soldiers, so they didn't want to be discovered by the Russians. I was able to make this map after several years of research, and I was able to go on this trip with my sister Tilly, and we did the trip together. Let me see. So by this time, I kind of knew who all the women were, and it was really the time for me to start to interview the family members of the women. They were all dead by the time I started my research. My Tante Hélène had passed away, and when I really started to do the research, I realized that Lon had died, and I wished so much that I had started sooner, because you know, I hadn't had a chance to interview the actual women. But what was interesting was the families brought great insight, and they had more information than they thought they did, even though every time I would contact a family member, they would say, oh, I know nothing about it, she never talked about it. But in the end, when I would spend several hours with them, slowly little bits and pieces would come out. So this is Gigi. She was the friend of Lon, and I was able to meet her family and get to know them quite well. She died in 2007. Her family, she also married a survivor. Many of the women married survivors. She married a survivor from Mauthausen, Thiemann, who she met as they were being interrogated. They met each other sitting on the bench outside of the interrogation room where they could hear people being tortured. And Gigi had a whole bunch of cigarette butts that she had collected in her pocket because they were precious. There was tobacco and cigarettes were so rare. And she gave her handful to Thiemann. They discovered they both spoke Dutch. They were both, he was in the Dutch resistance. She had come to Paris with Lon and had been arrested almost the day after she arrived because they walked right into a trap. But Thiemann said that he thought of it the whole time he was in the camps, that if he survived, he would find her and marry her. And Gigi was Gigi's family became very close to a woman named Mena, who was one of the group. Gigi comes from very aristocratic Dutch family, very, very wealthy. And she became really close friends with this woman, Mena, Yvonne Le Gouillou, who's a working class girl from Brittany, who says who said to her family that she joined the resistance not for political reasons, but just because she was in love with a boy. She became kind of one of my favorite characters of the 9 as I got to know her better. But I wouldn't have found her without Gigi's family, because the name that she chose for herself, Minna, is just the name of an artist that she liked, Minna Luput, a Dutch artist, who later, after the war, Gigi met that artist and said, I chose your name for my nom de guerre, and the artist got really mad. Said, do you realize what danger you put me in? But Gigi was kind of a little bit, she was a flirt, and she was kind of airy, and she had a little bit of well, she was always falling in love. She didn't tell her story to anybody but her daughter, but they were very, very close. She and her daughter would go to Galerie Lafayette and pretend to be British and speak with English accents and have tea. They had this kind of playful relationship. The daughter also died young, but the daughter told her son, Mena's grandson, and Guillaume, and he contacted me as soon as I had contacted the family, just so happy to tell me all that his mother had told him about his grandmother. He said it was a sacred transmission. And he, for example, Mina made a quilt with the coat that she wore for her daughter, and then later made a teddy bear for him, which he showed me, out of that same coat that she'd worn the whole time she'd been in the camps. And then I was also, because of that list from the archivist, and then from the archives that I went to, the National Archives, I was able to determine that José Bordanova was indeed the youngest. She was a Spaniard in the group. She had a beautiful singing voice. Even her military record mentions her beautiful singing voice, which is something. And she was famous for singing at night as the women were going to sleep in the block. But very, very young. She was probably in the resistance as young as 16, I think, because she was in foster care at a foster home in the south of France in Cannes, which was famous as part of the Marcel network for hiding Jewish children. And I'm pretty sure that, because it says that she joined the resistance the day she turned 18, I think that was the official registration because they couldn't do it sooner. But I think she was working in that network from very young age. Of the 9, she's the one I know the least about, unfortunately, afterwards, because she kind of disappears. I wish I'd had more time to look for her more, but it was time to turn in my manuscript to the editor. But I'm hoping that because of maybe this book, someone will come up and say, I'm actually related to José, and I can find out more about what happened to her later. She's beautiful. And then Jackie, I found out from the list that the archivist sent me, and also from other research, is this woman, Jacqueline Aubéry-Duboulet. Actually, I figured out Jackie from a wonderful archivist named Odette Pilpoul, who was an archivist in the camp. And when I went to the National Archives in Paris, I found her box of papers, and she was just an extraordinary person. In the original manuscript of my book, I had a whole chapter on her, which got cut for, because the editor, you have to keep the story going, I think very wisely. But I would love to write a book about Odette someday, because she's an amazing person. And because of Odette's list keeping and record keeping and note keeping, I was able to figure out who many of these women were, including Jackie. One of the things, just a side story about Odette, is that she, as they were emptying out the camps to start the death march, she hid and stayed behind in order to steal the documents from the Nazi records office before they would be destroyed. She stayed behind even though the rumor was that the whole camp was going to be, it was ringed with explosives and be destroyed. And in fact, the male camp right next door, that is what happened. The women, it didn't happen to the women because the Allies arrived 2 hours after they exterminated all the male people left in the male camp, basically the sick. So she, at the risk of her life, she stayed behind and gathered all of these documents that were so important to families, especially the Polish. It's around a 100-page list of names, and most of them are the Polish prisoners because they were the majority in the Leipzig camp. And she was able to tell them what had happened to their mothers and daughters, and anyway. So I figured out that Jackie was one of the 5,700 along with Nicole. She was on the same transport and arrived with Nicole. She was very sick. She had diphtheria. She was the oldest in the group. She was 29 at the time of the escape. Afterwards, she married Charles Feld, who's a famous resistance fighter in Paris, and she became a very well-known film editor. When I found her colleagues, she had no children. It's one of the side effects of diphtheria is infertility. When I found one of her colleagues and asked him about her time in the resistance and in the war, he said he had no idea. She'd never mentioned it. That many, many times in conversation they would talk about Charles, and they would talk about everything that Charles did, but it was never brought up and she never brought up that she had been in the camps, or that she had been in the resistance, or anything. It was quite a mystery to him. Her nephew was able to tell me more about her life before her first marriage. She was a war widow. He had died just from the beginning of the war. But he knew nothing either, really, about her work in the resistance. But she's kind of an astonishing person. Well, I won't tell you, that's part of the book, but she's great. And then the final person that was really important for me in this whole story was Zinka. She's René Le Bon. It took me a long time to figure out who she was because she married someone named Le Bon. So I couldn't quite get that. I was looking for the wrong last name. Her name was Zinka Le Bon Le Bon. And Le Bon is kind of like Smith in French, so it's also hard. She had joined the resistance really early in the war because her family was quite close to de Gaulle. Her whole family were in the resistance, and most of them were also arrested and deported. Her husband had been arrested and was in a prison, and she went to tell him that she was pregnant, hoping that would give him the will to continue living, and hoping that she could get a message to him. When she went to the prison, they arrested her. She was also on the list. But they didn't deport her in 1943 because she was pregnant, and at that point the French didn't deport pregnant women because they considered the child innocent. So she stayed in France and gave birth to her baby, France, who she named France, very patriotically. Was able to keep her baby for 18 days. The baby was taken away from her, and then she was deported. The fact that she wasn't deported till 1944 probably saved her life. She was very sick in the camp. She caught TB. But she was very famous. When I read accounts of Leipzig, almost all of them mention her from other people. She was small, incredibly brave. People really looked up to her, and she spoke all the time about her daughter, France. So I thought, I have to meet France. If France is alive, if I could find her, that would be an amazing thing. And, it's a long and complicated story, but I did meet France. There she is. It was sort of the great moment for me to find her, because I think I realized the importance of these stories when I talked to her. I found Zinka had a son after the war. I found him. I wrote to him. He's a Lacanian psychoanalyst, I found out. And I have a friend who's a Lacanian psychoanalyst in Marseille. So I wrote to her, and I said, Pam, do you know a Lacanian psychoanalyst by this name? And she said, yeah, and she sent me his email. I emailed him, and then he wrote me back and said, well, maybe you want to talk to my sister France, which was, amazing after all those years. So I went to see her. She lives also with Sophie. We drove to where she lives in the Drôme in Die, which is not far from where I live. And when I saw her, I said, you won't. She sort of fell into my arms. And before I went to see her, actually, we had been exchanging information. She didn't know very much about her mother. She knew her mother, but she didn't know anything about the war. She didn't know about what her mother had done. She didn't know anything about the escape. They never talked about it. Her mother had been very, very ill and died quite young of tuberculosis. So in a lot of ways, I had all this information for her, including these other accounts and including drawings of her mother that were in other books, which I was sending to her before we met. So when we met, we hugged, and I said, you won't believe how long I've been looking for you. And she started to cry, and she said, well, imagine me after 70 years to find my mother. And it was a beautiful day that I spent with her, very, very moving. And because of what I had sent her, she had decided to go into the attic of her house and look through these boxes of papers that she had gotten from her mother that she'd never dared look at. And suddenly she found an account of the escape in those papers, which she gave me. She had always experienced her mother as an abandonment and had always felt she said she felt her whole life that people would always leave her. And this act of recovery had helped sort of heal that for her. She and I have been in contact. She's a lovely person. The thing that was really true about her and the stories of these women was that because the women kept silent after the war, because what women did in the resistance was considered a little bit, well, de Gaulle actually said, step back, let the men take the glory, they've been so badly humiliated. He made a list of 1,038 compagnons de la libération, and only 6 of them are women. 4 of them were dead by the time he made that list. We know now that the resistance was probably 50% women. They had the ability and freedom to move around. They didn't have to have, if you were a young man, you were supposed to be working in Germany. A young woman had an ability to still be doing things, and a lot of the sort of the ground troops of the resistance were women, and they were young women, and they were beautiful, and they had a certain kind of liberty and also a certain kind of danger. So it was a taboo subject, and marriages were called off. If it was discovered if you were in Ravensbrück, so it was a largely forgotten history that is now in the last, I would say, 10 to 15 years has started to be talked about. And what I realized in this process was this is important. This is like a really there's this history that still needs to be told, and I realized that when I met France. That's from Zaza, who said, we were 9 who didn't want to die and who fought together to return to life. For me, really, the story is about their, about how they resisted, how they became friends, how they helped each other, how they escaped together, and how they got home. And also, very importantly, what happened to them after the war, and what happened to their families in this question of transgenerational trauma. And also, really, why it took 60 years for them to start to tell their stories. So I think that's, there they are. This is my 9. Thank you. Thank you.
So we're going to spend some time in conversation, but we invite you to please be part of that conversation. As mentioned, Lainey is going to, she has a basket with index cards, pencils. I invite you to share questions that I can share with Gwen. And Gwen, thank you so much. This is, if you had written on just one, if you had just written about your Antillean, my French is not so great, or non-existent, really. It would be that Dayenu, as we say. We say that certainly for Passover, but these 9 women, and you even mentioned additional women, Odette, who, in all of the heroes and women who are unmentioned. And we talked a little earlier. I was going to ask you a little bit more about your background and going into writing this book. But before we do that, I feel like because it was in one of the most recent slides, but also because I heard reactions behind me about de Gaulle's comment about letting the men take the glory, and the role of women in the resistance and in the war and throughout the story is so incredible. And yet not, but it was incredible in the fact that it was unexpected by the men around them.
Yeah, I think the thing that was sort of shocking is sort of this kind of game that the women, especially the group of 9, they're really young. They're between the ages of 20 and 29. They're young, pretty, they use that as kind of to make light of what they're doing, and at the same time, people like, Jackie, my tante Helene, Nicole, Zaza were really important in the resistance. They were actually they had very high level roles, what they were doing. I've actually learned more about what Helene was doing since I published this book, because she was not just working in this one region in Normandy and Brittany. She was traveling all over France, interviewing and figuring out kind of who to. I found this out much afterwards from someone who contacted me. And yes, I discovered incredible people. I mean, there's Odette Pilpol, who deserves a whole book. Of course, there's been books about Marie-Madeleine Fourcade, but for example, she led the largest resistance network in France. Their network was responsible for stopping the blockade in England, the U-boats. Her network was also responsible for finding the I never know how to pronounce it, the site where the Germans were making the V2 rockets. She had twice escaped capture. She was leading this group, and the British didn't even know she was a woman. She was and she was pregnant at one point and had giving birth while moving from site to site, running a network of over 1,000 agents. De Gaulle didn't name her as one of the compagnons de la libération. Partly, I think he was mad at her because she was allied with the British and not so much with his resistance networks. But she didn't take sides. She didn't get involved in sort of the infighting. And yeah, I mean, there's just amazing. The women were amazing, and again, they were amazing in the camps as well, I think.
And we've seen over the past decade or so, maybe a little bit longer, but the way in which the role of women has been lifted up in the resistance. There have been a number of books about women who are part of a resistance or spies in different places, and both in the U.S. and in Europe. And why do you think this is? I mean, there was certainly this sense. I mean, when you talked about, oh my gosh, who was it? Who was the editor at Elle?
Oh, Nicole.
Nicole, yeah, and how she was shut down for an article in the 60s.
Yeah, when she wrote the article, there's this incredible letter that her daughter showed me, where it's a survivor who writes, we can't, we are the Walking Dead. We can't talk about this. How dare you grandstand? We should keep silent as women and let and not speak these horrors and not let you shame us by letting people know what we've been through. And it was a fellow survivor who women started to really talk about it I think as there started to be Holocaust deniers, like Robert Fournier, who said, famously that there were no gas chambers, or it was only for lice or whatever horrors he said. I think at that point there were some of the women, including Geneviève de Gaulle, who was in Ravensbrück, who suddenly said, oh, we need to speak up. We need to talk about what we experienced and what we witnessed, because not only are they going to forget the whole thing, but they're going to, the women died in the camp. We have to honor at least our comrades who died. Interesting about Ravensbrück, it's the second largest concentration camp after Auschwitz-Birkenau, and it was built only for women. Most women, if they weren't sent to Auschwitz, went through Ravensbrück. It was sort of the central place, and from there they were dispersed to all the different commandos. But Ravensbrück, after the war, fell behind the Iron Curtain. The Soviets pretty much bulldozed it. They wanted to build a shopping mall. It became kind of framed as many of the camps did by the Soviets, as the comrade, the workers' fight against the capitalist West. So the communist prisoners were put, to the forefront. And famously, there's a statue in Ravensbrück called the Tragende, which is a woman carrying the body of Olga Bonario. It's Olga Bonario, a famous communist, Polish, carrying the body of another woman, and she's the symbol of this fight, but she was murdered because she was Jewish. It's not mentioned that she's Jewish until the fall of the Iron Curtain in '89. So even the camp itself and the history of the camp is kind of clouded.
There we go. And even though I'd heard of Ravensbrück, but this is certainly the most I've actually read about it certainly in one place. I wonder, partly behind the Iron Curtain, and also because of maybe some women didn't speak about it, but what was done there was so horrible. And imagining already the horrors of the Holocaust and what happened in the concentration camps in general. Is very difficult, but the fact that these things that happened were being done to women, and in particular, I think of talking about the nursery, and how vivid and awful, and those are the things that where is it a step too far? And it's so important that these stories are told, so that people know it happened.
That was the hardest for me to write about. Ravensbrück near the end of the war, so many women are arriving pregnant, especially the women come from Poland and Warsaw and the ghettos. And they...
And some of those women were pregnant because of the Soviets.
Soviets raping and the Germans raping. You know, it's you know, really, if you study Ravensbrück, you sort of study the capital of crimes against women and you also see sort of how women are always at the center of war. Like, they're not innocently waiting at home as we kind of perceive it. They're actually in the forefront of the suffering. And yeah, when I was doing the research on that part, that was really the hardest for me. I had to definitely walk away from it sometimes. I also kept things out of the book that I wish I had never read. Because they instituted a kind of nursery in Ravensbrück with that in name only. Instead of just killing the babies upon birth, they allowed them to be born and then basically let them die of starvation within months. And there's some incredible accounts. And in fact, I met a survivor who was in the nursery. She's an incredible woman. Though that was a really, and that was always, that brought up this question for me, always like, how much do you tell? How much do you not tell? I don't want it to be prurient, sort of voyeuristic violence, and I don't want to abuse the reader. You know, I want to have just enough that we get what's going on, but not too much. But I also want to honor what happened. You know, it's a delicate balance.
Tell us a little bit about that. I know your background is more as a poet than an historian, but you took on this project which became much more than just writing a book.
Yeah, so I've written poetry and short stories and children's books, and I've tried working on novels and that kind of thing. So this, I felt really out of my field. I felt really like I'm not. I used to say to everybody, I'm not a historian, but I've been told I have to stop saying that. But I'm not a historian.
You do need to stop saying that, clearly.
But and so, you know, the whole time I did, you know, that imposter feeling like, okay, I'm just gonna try to tell this story. You know, I was just moved. It just moved me. I couldn't stop. I mean, it was like I said. I started writing an essay, and then it turned into this research project, and then I just had so much to say about it, or so much I wanted to figure out. You know, but you know, I love writing. I love the words. And I wanted to bring it alive. I wanted to, because they're, in a lot of ways, these women are in the margins of history. You know, their military records are super thin compared to, for example, my tante Helene married a man named Daniel Benedict, who worked with Varian Fry, and then became a great, you know, he's a hero of the resistance and everything. And when I went and saw his military record, it's a big, thick thing like this. And when I saw hers, it's really 4 sheets of paper or something like that. I know that she did a lot. I mean, she was doing so much. So I just thought, like, if I'm going to write about these women, I have to build them. I have to bring them alive. I can't just, you know, stay as a sort of strict, you know, what's on the record kind of thing.
And they were so underestimated, and you alluded to this before in talking specifically about Helene, when they had the surprise inspection at the factory, because as we heard, they were sabotaging. Because of her background, they were able to do that. And, you know, there were many times that they were able to play the sort of ditzy woman card of, I just flick the switch. I just do what they tell me. But clearly, there was a lot more going on in the background.
It's actually quite funny the way they used their that sort of female wiles. I mean, it was also interesting to write that now in this day and age, because it gets, you know, kind of gets touchy. People, because they were very proud of how pretty they looked. They were very proud of using their beauty to, you know, or their kind of like flirtations to kind of throw men off the trail. You know, they got it, you know, there's one point where they get this paper, they get this policeman to write on a piece of paper a little bit of a map, and they get it because on the letterhead it says the police station of Reizen, and then they're able to use that to say they've been given a laissez-passer, you know. So they're always subverting. They're sort of using the men and subverting them in a way. Yeah.
And I saw it in that way, certainly, that they were brilliant in how they were able to manipulate situations. And I'm not saying that is a female trait. We certainly know people of both genders who can manipulate. But they were they were brilliant in some of the ways that they did that, but also that there was, even in the way that they made sure that they didn't lose their dignity, that in spite of what was being done to them and around them, that they made sure, whether it was having, and all of the stereotypes of French culture, they wanted to look chic, they wanted to have their makeup, and but also to how they appeared, but even in the way that they brought humanity into really giving each other courage and the women around them. And you know, even though we focus on these 9, there were other women clearly around them who they also inspired, because some of them talked about and remembered them from Ravensbrück and from Leipzig. But I was thinking in particular of the recipes, and I'd love if you talk about that. It's incredible.
Sometimes I talk about it. Yeah, that was one of the great things. In fact, So one of the, perhaps you know, some of you know, that there were that one of the things that starving people do, which is kind of counterintuitive, is they love to talk about food. And the women developed this ritual at night before they go to sleep, where one person would recite a recipe in minute detail, every step along the way, so that they could almost eat it. They could almost imagine in their imagination. So they would do these things like a bavarois, you know, things with lots of sugar and eggs and milk and cream, these and fruit and things that they hadn't seen in ages. They would carefully, almost like poetry, would tell this recipe. They loved that so much that then they stole paper and pencil, and they would write down these recipes, and they would pass them from block to block, and they would create recipe books. And Gigi's family showed me her recipe book. And Nicole also kept a recipe book. They cherished these items so much that they actually escaped with them. You know, they didn't have that much, but they managed to escape with these little books that they had. Every little teeny space is written in these tiny scripts of these recipes. It's an amazing, and they pass them around. It's an amazing, because in a way it was a way for them to have to share a memory together. They Sunday afternoons, when it was the one time they didn't have to work, they would have Sunday meal together, and they would sit around in a circle, and each person would they would share a meal. They would talk about an item that they would eat together. When I met with Zinka's son, he almost immediately he said, you know, I'm anorexic, and so was Zinka. After the war, she hated to eat. She had tuberculosis, and he goes, I inherited that from my mother. I'm getting over it, he said. And then he had his son with him, who's a chef, and that son, the grandson, said, you know, I'm trying to heal the family. And he joked, he said, you know, my mother always said that she had won an award as best cook, but she hated to cook. But she had won an award as best cook in the camp. So it was, and it was a kind of a way of being solidarity amongst each other. And they even talk about when this group of Hungarian Jewish women arrived late near the end in April, or maybe late March. I think they were able to find somebody who spoke Hungarian, and they had a whole new cuisine. They said we were so happy to have a whole new. We learned about goulash.
You mentioned solidarity, and one of the things that you wrote in the book is a quote by their fellow prisoner, Juliette Bess, who wrote about solidarity in the camp, saying that charity is when you give what you can, solidarity is giving when you have nothing to give. And there are certainly many examples of female solidarity in the camp, and I'm wondering if you could address how solidarity plays a key role in survival.
Actually, I love that quote by Juliette Bess. It's so beautiful.
I was so glad that you had shared that with me as well, because it was something I marked in the book as well.
So one of the things that they did, they had the gamelle de la solidarité, so it's the bowl of solidarity. They had an extra bowl, and during the night, the sort of terrible watery soup that they were given, they would each, if they could, put a spoonful of that soup into this bowl. And they would pass it around, and then they would give that bowl to whoever they thought that day needed it the most. So maybe someone had been beaten, or someone had received bad news. And so they didn't have, they're starving, they were hungry, and even in that moment they were able to share their spoonful with someone else, which is just incredible to me. In fact, one of the things that I really wanted to highlight in the book, because I feel like on the one hand we have a lot of of accounts, and as we should, about the horrible cruelty and the sort of the bureaucratic machine of murder that was the Nazi concentration camp system. But against that, there are these incredible acts of amazing bravery and kindness, and they're not part of a big machine, they're just individual or group, and I feel like they should be given some weight too, and be given, you know, as sort of held up, because that too is a story. There was resistance. I mean, the prisoners of Buchenwald liberated themselves. There were women fighting back. They were Sabbath. They were, you know, it wasn't just this kind of like passive victims, you know. I wanted to show that, because whenever I ran into those kind of stories, and there were many, I was always just dumbstruck by it, how the beauty of it.
And they experienced that in the escape, which is in many ways the heart of the book is about their escape, but also bringing in the stories and how, you know, you met them one by one,
right.
And their individual stories and perspectives, but the story of their solidarity and togetherness is incredible. But even as they escaped, they were not out of danger, and they spent 9 or 10 days, 10 days, sort of continuing to try to survive.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then post that even, it was not so easy.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about
I mean,
that?
for a lot of ways, I started to see this book as a little bit like an Odysseus, like a group of soldiers trying to go home, and like in Odysseus, they run into all kinds of problems on their escape, and also the importance of hospitality, the kindness of strangers, you know, sort of using their wily ways to get out of bad situations. They're still hungry, they're still starving, they're so exhausted. When I traced the route with my sister Tilly, sometimes I realized they only did about 5 kilometers that day. They were just so tired and broken. I mean, one had diphtheria.
It's amazing. They had, you know, one didn't have shoes for some of the time, but they had severe physical injuries and impediments that they were dealing with.
Yeah, they were quite very ill group, but they slowly get better in a weird way during that escape. And then, of course, the question of the Odyssey, and I think this story is, can you come home from a war? You know, and what I really discovered in interviewing the families is how profound that trauma is still, even amongst the third generation who don't have only a distant relation to their mother or aunt. There were some very moving stories of this kind of trauma, like, as I said, the story with Zinka's son, but also Zaza's children, and well, all of them really. Every family that I met, I could sense and they had stories of how that return was not an easy return. In a lot of ways, that period of escape was just a prelude to a much longer journey for these women back in their normal lives, back in the returning to life, as Zaza says. Interestingly, to me, the way that Zaza really frames her story just the day of escape, because what happens to her afterwards in her later life, I would discover, was quite traumatic and difficult, and was directly this question of how do you come home from war? How do you come home from such suffering? And this kind of intergenerational trauma. When I interviewed Zaza's family, it was on the anniversary of the First World War. It was the 100th anniversary of the First World War in La Rochelle, and it just hit me. Oh, First World War, then second, it just keeps going. And actually what was interesting too is a lot of the children of the survivors would say something to me like, well, I was a child of 68. Well, 68 in Paris and France was this big revolution, which seems to be a direct relationship to the end of the war. It's the next generation kind of feeling that upheaval again.
Speaking of the next generation, it was amazing, and I'm not giving it away because you shared it, but when you actually found Franz, I started crying, because I know that was all that she was living for, was well, certainly for also her husband, sadly, but really to find that, and then to have Franz not really know the story, and she was so much a part of it.
It was.
I think you said that, she said, 75 years old, and I'm just learning about my mother.
Yeah, no, that for me was like, it didn't really matter what happened afterwards. I felt like everything was for that kind of.
You know, many people talk about the fact that it's so hard to share the stories, and because it is in many ways like reliving some of the pain, both physical, emotional. But the fact that the 9 women didn't stay connected, I mean, a few of them did a little bit, and then Jose just disappears. And wondering, you know, yes, in the aftermath of war and everyone dispersing to returning home, but so many of them being from France.
Yeah, I thought about that a lot too. Like they kind of disperse. I mean, Gigi stays friends with Mena and with Lon. Lon stays connected with Zinka, and I think my tante Hélène stayed somewhat connected with Zaza for a while. But for people who kind of, Jackie just kind of I mean, I found her, but she was, yeah, I wonder, I don't know, but I wonder if that sort of intensity, then they wanted to be quiet about it. I think it was too you know, they didn't, they just sort of decided not to see each other, or they really wanted to, like, okay, we're going to start a new page, this is a new life, that's all in the past. A lot of them, I think, didn't want to talk to their children about it to protect their children. They felt like it was too heavy a burden. A lot of them talked to their grandchildren and not their children, like Gigi,
or other family
or
members,
a niece. You know, the Gigi's grandchildren remembered a summer when they were all staying in her house. She had a beautiful house out in the country, and she was a great cook. And every day at lunch, she told them another episode of The Escape, but they experienced it like a comic book. You know, she told it kind of as a comic book story.
I want to pause and see if we have any questions from those of you who are gathered here.
I found it incredible when I was reading, when you had that up there, that de Gaulle asked them to step back and let the men take the credit. Was there egos involved there?
Well, as you know, the French army capitulated quite quickly, you know, so there was a lot of, and then there was a huge collaboration. I mean, a lot of French collaborated, and so there was a sense of, you know, the men had been badly humiliated. Like they didn't look glorious in the war. The whole collapse of the French army was very embarrassing, and so I think it was a little bit that he felt like if women get glory, it'll make the French men look even worse. Important to know, women got the vote in France in 1944. So you really have to imagine the role of women, what it was like, and for them to suddenly not only be part of the resistance, but play key roles in the resistance, that seemed sort of unacceptable.
And wasn't his daughter a prisoner? Or
Geneviève was in Ravensbrück and was a friend of my tante Hélène's, and yeah, she was in the resistance. It was mostly writing in an important newspaper. I'm trying to remember the name of it offhand. I can't quite remember. She's kind of responsible, interestingly, for passing the word around about who de Gaulle was, because he was a lowly major, I think, and suddenly he's in England saying he's the head of the resistance, and nobody even knows who he is. Plus, his name de Gaulle sounds like he's aristocracy, and there was this kind of royalty, the royalists, you know, so it had to be clear that he wasn't a royalist, and that, you know, how to position him. Nobody knew who he was, and she wrote several sort of profiles of him about her uncle that was really responsible for people learning who he was. They could hear him on the radio, but they didn't know who he was, and her pieces were really important for that.
You know, we may be sparse because of COVID, but I've got to tell you, your work has been a real contribution.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I feel like we should end there, but we're not going to quite yet because I'm going to let your wife have the last word.
There was a series, French TV series, The Village.
Yeah, the Village Français, yeah.
I saw this, I guess we went for a class at Osher, and it was a history class, and so they presented this whole series,
Yeah.
which I was told was really followed it, and it was featuring many of the women who were very involved and who were very important to the resistance. And I guess, I don't have a question, but it's an observation. It's generations to generations to generations
I have two things to say about that. One is, thank you for that comment. For example, in where I live down in Provence, I have a friend who, he was in Casablanca, so he's my age, and he met a woman who was a little bit older than him, who was also French, who was there, and he started talking to her, and he asked her where she's from, and she says, well, I don't really know because I was a hidden child. Well, where were you hidden? And she says, Provence. And he said, oh, where in Provence? And anyway, turns out she was hidden in his village. And he's so astonished, right? He thinks, oh my gosh, who hid you in my village? It's a little teeny village, Cazeneuve, minute. And she says, I don't know. He had a group of us children in a cabanon in the forest. But he was the guy who roasted and ground the coffee, the torréfacteur, because he smelled of coffee. And it's his grandfather. And this is how he learns that his grandfather had hidden children. She starts to cry because she didn't even know his name. They were rushed off onto a boat to North Africa right after the war. She's like, I want to go see him. I want to say thank you to him. And he says, well, he's in a hospital in Marseille. He's really in the end of his life. So they went to Marseille. They got on a plane. She was so desperate to see him. And in the hospital room, he tells his family that, yes, indeed, he hid children during the war. He was ashamed to tell them this because he had done it at risking their safety. If he had been caught, they would have been killed. He felt it was a selfish act, what he was doing. And he was going to go to his grave without telling about it because he felt he had acted out of his own, need to help, and that was very, selfish and putting his whole family in danger. So that's a little bit of I love that series, La Vie Française. It's great. But the other thing I wanted to say about this, which really hit me when I was thinking about the healing and the generations, I of course started to think about African Americans and the 500 years of slavery, what that kind of intergenerational trauma and that kind of, how do we heal from that? That's just an immense, immense project. It's so large. Anyway.
What's also amazing is that every time we open a new book, we hear new stories and new perspectives, and the importance of preserving those stories, and the importance of you writing this, and of Odette, people like Odette, who stayed and gathered the papers, and it's up to us to now be the keepers, the preservers of these stories, and tell these stories, and you've done that so incredibly beautifully, and we are so grateful for you sharing that on the page, but even more for having you here today and sharing that with all of us. So I want to thank Gwen Strauss for being here. I want to thank all of you for being with us today, and I encourage you to stop by and have Gwen sign a book for you, and to continuing to support. Certainly, Gwen will look forward to looking and seeing maybe additional stories that come from this. We'll see. And I want to thank Eliza for keeping her mom company, and in this last leg of this part of your journey, and we wish you safe travels.